Hi, my name's Mel and welcome back to Bookish Brummy. So in my spooky reading challenge this month I set myself Pet Sematary by Stephen King as one of the books to be read, and I've recently just finished it in the last few days. So I thought that it was worth doing a summary video of it. Also, I've kind of noticed that there's a lot of Stephen King ranking videos on YouTube, which I'm not ready to make one of those yet because I still feel like I need to read quite a few more before I could do that. But this one, Pet Sematary, always seems to rank in the top 10 of people's books. So I've been looking forward to reading this one for quite some time, but I wanted to save it for October because it felt like a Halloween sort of type book. And I have to admit, I've saved it for the perfect time of the year because if you want a book that's going to give you the creeps, this is going to do that. It's absolutely perfect for an October Halloween read. So I started making quite a few videos now where I've done sort of a summary of a Stephen King book, and I'd like to continue doing that. I won't always do Stephen King books, I will do some other books over time, but because we're in October it seems like the right thing to do to cover Stephen King novels because he's got some really creepy novels, and I'm sort of guessing there's a lot of people who are reading Stephen King novels in this month. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into Pet Sematary. Just a bit of a disclaimer before we start. I am going to be talking about details of the story, and I will be talking about the ending of the story. So you might prefer to watch this video after you've already read the book, and then you can see if your opinion matches my opinion. And if you want to talk about anything that I've said, then you can write your questions or comments in the comment section below the video. So this one I think was published in about 1984, so it's one of his older ones, and he actually says in the beginning of the book, before you get into the story, that he had written this story and then just put it in his drawer and wasn't really sure if he wanted to publish or not because he felt like the subject matter was so dark. He thought maybe it's even too dark for me, so he'd not actually approached his current publisher with it. And I have to admit, I did sort of smile a little bit because he put in there, you know, he couldn't believe he had gone there. He was like, am I really going there in this book? And I thought, well, compared to that scene in It, I understand what he's saying now I've read the end of this about he can't believe he went there, but after that scene in It, I still think that that tops of all the scenes I've read in Stephen King's book as like, did you really go there, Stephen? So I think that the subject matter in this is very, very dark, and we'll get into it when we sort of get nearer to the discussing the ending of the book. But I'm really glad that he did go there, and I'm sure he did because this has been one of his most popular novels, I think. As I said, always does really well in the ranking videos. And the reason that it ended up in publication is because he was leaving his publisher at that time and moving to a different one, and the old publisher said, well, you still owe us a book. And he was sort of thinking, okay, well, I've got this one in my drawer. And he handed it over to them, and then they decided, yeah, actually we will publish that one. So they did a bit of editing, and that's how we ended up with Pet Sematary. Now, I'd always wondered prior to reading this book why cemetery is spelt with an S rather than the correct spelling with a C, and he does answer that as well in this book. It's really interesting that apparently he and his wife had moved with their family somewhere, and there was an actual pet cemetery for pets, and a child had made the sign for it, and it was spelt with an S, and that was quite endearing, and that stuck with him. So this is why this book is also titled Pet Sematary with an S rather than a C. So we'll sort of get into the story now. So our main character is Lois Creed, who is a doctor, and his wife Rachel Creed, and they have two young children. So there's Ellie Creed, who I think is about 5 or 6 years old in this story, and then Gage Creed, who is just a baby really. I mean, he's a toddler. He's toddling around, but he's just learning to talk. Sometimes has a bottle, but is often on solid food. So Ellie's like in her first year of school, I think. So they're very, very young children, and they've just moved from the state of Chicago over to Maine, and Lois has taken a job at the university as a doctor. So he's not in one of the main hospitals, he's in the infirmary in the university, and he treats all the university students mainly with bumps and scrapes, but occasionally there's something more serious, you know, that he has to deal with. So when they move into this house, it's a beautiful house on the street, but the street itself is an incredibly noisy, busy street of traffic. And as soon as they get there, they pull up. Lois has lost his keys, and this elderly man from over the road called Judd Crandall comes over and he goes, well, I've got a key to your house. Me and my wife have lived here. I've lived here my entire life. And she moved in with me, obviously, when they got married. I've always had a key to this place, so you can have my key. So he goes and fetches that key. And Judd is like a key character in the story because he becomes Lois's really, really good friend. In fact, Lois describes him as the father that he never had that should have been. And that's how close they are. And Judd's really sweet, but he does warn them as they're moving in, you really need to watch your children and any pets that you've got on this road because quite a few get killed on here. So you're sort of already getting a sense of the road is dangerous. So yeah, so they move in and they've also got their cat, Winston Churchill, who's known as Church throughout the book. So a sweet young family have moved in and they strike up this friendship with their elderly neighbours across the road, who's Judd Crandall and his wife Norma Crandall. Now, Norma's not always very well, she's got quite bad arthritis, but she's a sweet lady and she's happy whenever Lois goes over there or takes the children over there or whatever. So they all get on really, really, really well. So they're all beginning to settle in and Lois goes for his first day at the university. And he has quite a shocking first day because there is this young university student lad brought in by the name of Victor Pascal, and he was out jogging in that morning and he'd got hit by a car and his injuries are really, really severe, and he ends up dying on the floor in the infirmary after they brought him in, which is quite a shock because obviously you would expect at university you're mainly just dealing with like some sprains, broken bones, maybe the odd few stitches when students have got a bit rowdy on a night out and stuff. So he wasn't really expecting on his first day to have somebody die on him. And he's right over Victor's body when Victor passes away. So he has a couple of nightmares about that. He feels like he dreams that Victor is sort of there next to him, which is obviously not the case, but it's quite traumatising, like what he's gone through. Anyway, out the back of the house where he and his wife live, there is a load of land, and he's not actually really investigated that. So his neighbour Judd says, oh, we should go for a walk up there because there's a cemetery up there just for pets. And the children from the local town, they come and they mow it and they maintain it. And, you know, that's where they bury their pets, and we just let them do that. So one day Judd comes over, not long after Victor has passed away. It might be on the same day or a couple of days afterwards. And you probably won't see the relevance of Victor to the story at the start, but it's important that we mention him because he will become more important later on. So Judd comes over and he says to Lois's little girl Ellie, do you want me to show you the pet cemetery? And she says, yeah. So they all go as a family, they go for a walk, they even take the baby in the front holder, and I think it's like about a mile walk. They have to go up a hill and they go into the cemetery, and there's all these like homemade gravestones that are sort of in a concentric circles, and they've all got like these homemade what would you call them, like plaques on them, and some of them are so old that you can't even read the names, but there's like cute things. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head the name of the animals, but imagine like Fluffy, and there was one that you know, like say Fluffy was obedient, like an obedient dog. And Judd sort of tells them there's been lots of types of pets buried up here. Somebody even buried their prize-winning bull up there. You know, you got like fish, probably rabbits, cats, dogs, you know, and the graves go back before 1910 by the look of it. So we know that Judd has buried his dog when he was a kid in around about 1910, and Judd said he was born in 1900, and he had been using that graveyard after other children had told him about it for his pet, and they've been using it for their pet. So we know that this graveyard now is like probably 100 years old. It goes back. So anyway, it's obviously a little bit creepy, but it's Ellie's first introduction to the idea of death. I don't think she, obviously being so young, had really sort of thought about it before. So when they get back from the graveyard and they get home, she starts asking questions about death, and she gets a little bit upset at the idea of her own cat Church dying. And Rachel, her mum, she doesn't really like talking about death because she'd actually lost her sister when she was a child, so that had been very traumatic for her, so she didn't really want to talk to Ellie about death. She didn't want Ellie to think about it. She just wanted her to, maybe consider that when she was older, but she didn't want to ruin her childhood thinking about it. But because Lois is a doctor, and death is something that he's come across quite a few times, already in his career, he knows that death is as natural as birth, and he tries to tell Rachel, well, she learned where babies came from now, so maybe we do need to sort of introduce her to the idea of what might happen when you pass. But Rachel absolutely puts her foot down, and he's like, absolutely not. I don't know what these kind of conversations with her. I don't want her to be upset or scared or anything. So, in the end, Lois acquiesces and was like, yeah, okay. And he's still having like a few horrible dreams about Victor Pascoe as well. So he's like, well, yeah, okay, like let's not upset Ellie, but surely we will have to talk about it at some point. Anyway, because Rachel has had such a reaction to the idea of Ellie knowing anything about death, Lois begins to worry a little bit about the cat, Church. She's very attached to the cat, like Ellie always sleeps with Church. She thinks he's the most wonderful pet ever. So the idea of him dying, and she's so upset at that, he starts to think, well, we're living on a very, very busy main road here, and there's every chance actually that she could, Church could get hit by a car and die. So he's trying to think, well, how can I prevent that? So in the end, he decides, because the cat has not been neutered, that he'll get him neutered, because unneutered cats don't tend to wander as much as neutered cats, according, to the sort of medical stuff that he was reading at the time. So he says to Ellie, we're going to go and get Church neutered, and then he'll probably stay at home more with you, won't go for a wander. And Ellie doesn't seem too bothered by that, so she's like, fine. So anyway, Ellie and Rachel are away from the house with Gage one day. They've gone to visit Rachel's parents, who Lois does not get on with. Rachel's dad absolutely despises Lois, told Rachel this before she married him, and they don't really have anything to do with each other. So when the grandparents are seeing the children, Rachel flies them to where they are. I can't remember exactly where it is that they live, but they live in a different state. So Lois is at home by himself, and Church has an accident. Even though he's been neutered, he then gets called over by Judd and is like, do you recognise this as your cat? And there is a dead cat on the floor that's been hit, looks like it's been hit by a truck, his neck is broken. And Lois is like, oh no, that's like terrible, what am I going to tell Ellie? And he's sort of wondering, because Ellie's away, maybe he can pretend like cat wandered off, not that it died, so she doesn't have to face that the cat has died. So Judd says to him, no, let's go and bury the cat. So this is where Judd takes Lois back to Pet Sematary with the cat, but instead of where they were originally, they climb over this big heap of tree that looks quite dangerous, but they get over it and then they go across a bog and into the woods beyond. And in the woods beyond, there's another burial ground. And this burial ground was actually belonged to the indigenous people called the Micmac tribe. And they are actually a North American indigenous tribe to the woodlands. And I think today there's about 30,000 in their population. So we don't really go into them too much in the book, but we know that that's like sacred ground that belonged to them, and is currently actually contested between the government and the tribe about who owns what. But that had been an old burial ground of theirs, Judd tells him. So Judd has him dig the grave for the cat in this, sacred ground, and says that they had made animal sacrifices before, apparently, according to tales that had been passed down by mouth, and that they had buried those animals, in this area, and then they'd sort of piled up rocks on top of the graves, which is like tradition. So Judd sits there having a cigarette, and he tells Lois, you need to dig the grave, I can't dig the grave, it has to be you. So Lois is a little bit, I don't really know why we're going to all this effort and why we're doing this, and we've had to climb over this big thing, so it's not like I can bring Ellie here, but then again, maybe Ellie just needs to think that he's disappeared. So he does what Judd says, and he buries the cat, and for some reason I like doing this like in the dark. They get back home, and Lois is knackered. The ground was like really stony that he was trying to dig. And Judd goes to bed, goes home, and Lois is like, right, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. He then wakes up the next day to find that the cat has returned. And he's like, maybe he wasn't really dead. Maybe he was just stunned and he's like had to dig his way out of the grave, but he's got this like horrible smell, like this earthy, dead smell about him. And he doesn't seem quite right, like a little bit, the way it's sort of described is a bit clumsy, you know, and not quite all there. But Lois is like, well, I must have just stunned him, and I guess, you know, he's had a bit of an ordeal, he's been buried alive, so he sort of lets it go. But he goes and tells Judd about this, and is like, Judd, like, the cat has come back. And that's when he starts to realise that Judd knows a lot more about this burial ground than he's letting on. And essentially, as the story unfolds, Judd sort of makes him aware that animals that are buried in that particular area of the Micmac burial grounds will get resurrected. And he had done it before with one of his dogs called Spot. So he'd buried him there in 2010. And then the burial ground that they'd visited with Ellie, which is not sacred ground, he'd reburied the dog in there then a few years later after the dog had died again. So even though like these pets are resurrected, they're not immortal, you know, that they will die again. Anyway, Judd sort of tells him that he wishes he actually hadn't told him about this burial ground, but he feels the burial ground has got a bit of a hold on him. Because once you know you can resurrect life, it sort of makes you feel like God, makes you feel very powerful. So he felt like he had to share that with somebody, and he wanted to share it with Lois. However, he just says it's not really a good thing. And there was somebody who buried their prize-winning bull up there, this bull called Hanratty. Hanratty had gone like absolutely mental, and the guy had ended up having to reshoot his pet to get rid of him because the undead version of it was quite dangerous. But he says that he doesn't think that Church is dangerous because he didn't think that his dog Spot was dangerous, but they just go like a little bit odd. But in this way, it sort of saves Ellie from knowing that he's dead. But Judd said he sort of wanted to teach Ellie a lesson that sometimes dead is better. So maybe if she comes home and finds this cat that's not quite the cat that it was, maybe when he eventually dies, she won't feel too bad about it, which is like a bit of an odd way to teach a child about death. It sort of makes sense when they talk about it in the book, but I think what makes more sense is the whole power thing, that Judd was wanting to share his knowledge of that power with somebody, and that's the kind of hold that the graveyard has over people that know about it. Anyway, Lois is like really put off by this cat. He sort of doesn't even like touching him. He like gets him out of the house with the broom and everything, doesn't even want to pick him up, and he just constantly smells. Ellie gets back from visiting her grandparents, and she just remarks on how much the cat smells, and actually over the next few weeks she becomes less attached to the cat. She still does give it attention and everything, but she's a bit grossed out by him. And the cat, like, no matter how many times you kick him out of the house, somehow seems to find a way back in, and he really, really creeps Lois out. And Ellie actually says at one point, I think now I wouldn't mind if Church died, I could handle it. So in a way, Judd's lesson did sort of work with her, but, you know, like, yeah, I think it's the reason that he shared it wasn't really for Ellie's benefit. I think he shared the knowledge because it was powerful knowledge, and, you know, he's an old man, he said, you know, so he's going to go soon, so he wanted somebody else to have that knowledge at the time, whether or not it was fair or not. Anyway, of course, Lois asks the question that we're all thinking here, which is, if this ground could resurrect an animal, what would happen if we buried a human being in it? Now, Judd is like, no, absolutely you can't do that. And initially he says that nobody's ever done it, but it transpires later on that somebody had lost their son in the Second World War, and when their son's body was delivered back to them, the father had actually taken his son to this burial ground and buried him in it, and then he'd come back to life. And again, he had not been right, not exactly zombified, but it really freaked out a lot of people that also attended his wedding and assumed he was dead, and they were actually going to send a representative around from the armed forces to check the grave to see if it was empty or not, to see what was actually in it, and see if the person that they thought had died had actually died, because otherwise if he wasn't, then he had defected, which is obviously a crime. Anyway, the kid who has sort of been reanimated and come back to life, he is quite dangerous, and the situation ends up where his dad actually ends up shooting him, I think, like re-killing him, and sets fire to their family home with himself in it, So it all goes up in flames, and it's just like an example of no, we should never like reanimate a human being. Later on, slightly later on, the little kid, the smallest one, Gage, the one who's a toddler, he's playing outside, and he starts running towards the road, and Rachel and Lois are trying to shout to the kid, get back, and Lois runs after him, but Lois is just a little bit too late, and unfortunately Gage is hit by a big truck and is killed on the spot, which is absolutely terrible, and it absolutely destroys Lois and Rachel, and Ellie can't cope either, absolutely devastated. Judd, says to Lois, don't you think about reburying him in burial ground? I've told you this story, like it's just not worth it. Don't do it. And Lois is kind of like, on the one hand, he knows he can't do it, but on the other hand, he knows he has the power to do it if he wants to. He has the power to stop Rachel's pain by bringing Gage back to life. So he picks out the coffin, um, and he picks the coffin for his son, which is the easiest one to dig back up again. And Judd kind of realizes this and again tries to lecture him into saying, like, you really shouldn't think about bringing your son back to life. No good can come of this. I've already told you about the father who tried to do this with his son. Pets are different to people. Reanimating the cat is probably fine. Reanimating a human being is not. But Lois has so much grief that after his son is buried, he convinces Rachel to go and fly back to her parents with Ellie, and says that he would join them in a few days. But he wanted to just sort some stuff out and get some cover for his job, but he felt that they would be better off with her parents, so she can get some cover from them. And he's obviously struggling with the grief himself and struggling to actually give her any comfort, or even give their little kid Ellie any comfort over the death of his son. So she begrudgingly decides to go, although she kind of feels that he's hiding something from her. And Ellie keeps having these dreams, like premonitions, that her dad's going to die, something's going to happen while they're gone, and she keeps telling her mum this on the flight when they've left him, and she's really upset about it. While that's going on, they're now out of state. They've flown out of state to get to the grandparents, and Ellie's very insistent something's going to happen to Daddy. And Rachel's a bit like, I know he's hiding something from me. Lois then basically buys some tools, climbs into the cemetery at night, goes to great effort digging up his son Gage, fills all the ground back in, and then has to hike back over this fence, manages to get the body back to his house. And Judd notices that Lois hasn't been back home, and Judd is quite concerned that Lois is going to try this, even though he's warned him not to. And then he's even more concerned when Rachel calls him from out of state and says, have you seen Lois? I'm a bit worried about him. And Judd keeps trying to say to her, like, don't worry, I've got it covered. So he's like watching out of his window, waiting for Lois to come home, because he knows that Lois can't bury Gage unless he goes through his own property to get to this pet cemetery, because then he's got to climb over that other cemetery, like, and the sort of fell of trees and stuff, to get to the Micmac burial ground. So he's pretty convinced he can head Lois off. Unfortunately, this is all happening in the middle of the night, so come 2 o'clock in the morning, Judd has like fallen asleep. Lois has already arrived home with Gage's body and has begun his journey up to the burial ground. Rachel, meanwhile, has decided that she can't sit out of state thinking that something is wrong with Lois. She's fearing that he's going to commit suicide or something. That's like her main concern. I think she doesn't know anything about the reanimation of the pet, let alone that Lois might be doing that with her son. So she decides to try and get a flight back. But one of the flights is delayed, so she manages to get so far, then she has to hire a car, and she's trying to drive back to Maine in a car, because she's convinced something's going to happen to Lois. She calls Judd again, and Judd's like, well, you know what, come round to my house when you get here and I'll explain everything, but please don't worry. And he won't tell Rachel the deal about the pet cemetery at this point. So Lois carries on. He gets to the Micmac burial ground with Gage. He reburies him, comes back home, is absolutely exhausted, goes to bed and goes to sleep. Rachel arrives just before dawn, and Judd, actually before Rachel arrives home, Judd wakes up and realises that Lois is back home, but before he can do anything about it, he senses that there's something in the house with him, and as it transpires, it's the cat, Church. So he's like, oh, okay, it's just the cat. But then Gage turns up and Gage kills him, basically with a scalpel that he's stolen out of Lois's house from his doctor's bag. So it just sort of shows that actually the reanimation of people doesn't really work very well. Gage has gone really, really evil. You know, his language skills are better than they were before he died. He seems to know stuff about people that they didn't know about themselves. And he sort of seems to be like the personification of evil, really, coming out of this little kid. And he's quite violent, so he stabs Judd. Meanwhile, Rachel arrives back and she goes over to Judd's house and she tries to get in. The door is open. And she realises that he's dead, and then Gage attacks her and kills her. Lois then wakes up the next morning about 9 o'clock quite refreshed, and he's not really expecting to see Gage reanimated just yet because it had taken until about midday for the cat to come back. So he's getting up, he's about to have a shower and everything, and then he feels like something is in the house with him, something is not right, and he instantly is like going for a look around. And then he sees there's like this, he doesn't know it's Rachel's car because she's got a hire car, but he sees a hire car outside of Judd's house. I think that's a little bit odd. So he crosses the road to go and have a look, and he notices Rachel's passport and everything on the seat. So he's like, okay, maybe she's at Judd's. He goes into Judd's house and finds both Judd and Rachel deceased in there, and that they'd been stabbed with a scalpel. And Lois realises that Gage has done this, and Gage has stolen his scalpel. So Lois is obviously out of his mind because now his wife has died as well, and he sits there in hysterics crying in the corner for a little bit, as would be expected. So in the end he decides to set fire to Judd's house, and you think that essentially he's just burning the house down to get rid of Gage, to get rid of Judd's body, and also get rid of evidence of Rachel. But that's not entirely actually what's happening. So Gage obviously dies in this last showdown. Lois kills him. So he's in the house. Judd's body remains in the house. The house is on fire. And then some colleagues come actually to check on Lois because they're worried about him. Find the neighbour's house is on fire, and they're like, oh my god, the house is on fire. The people like calling the fire brigade and everything. And his colleague who's standing there turns around and thinks, I'm sure I saw Lois going through his own back gate, and he was carrying something in a white sheet. And what he has done is he has taken Rachel in a sheet because he's going to go and bury her in the Micmac burial ground. This colleague follows Lois because he's worried about him. He's like, what are you doing? Do you have Rachel there? And Lois is trying to explain to him that the problem with Gage is Gage had been left too long, and that's why he went bad. But Rachel had only just died, so he's pretty convinced if he now buries Rachel immediately, Rachel won't be damaged by the same thing that damaged Gage or the other young boy that had been buried many, many years ago. This colleague really has no idea what Lois is going on about. He tries to follow him for a bit, but in the end he can't get over that big dead fell of leaves and tree and everything, so he ends up turning back. And as he walks away from the scene, he actually really forgets why he was there and what's going on. Lois, anyway, continues to bury Rachel, goes back home, and then the next day the story ends when Rachel comes back into the house and presents herself to Lois. We have absolutely no idea if she is as evil as Gage was or the other guy that had been reanimated. So it could have been happy ever after for Lois having reanimated Rachel. She could be okay, or he may then end up having to kill her. It's a really, really creepy story, and part of what I was talking about Victor Pascoe earlier was that when Ellie was having these visions of something happening to Lois, him being involved in a fire or him being in danger, which was in danger from Gage, it was actually Victor Pascoe who presented his spirit to Ellie and said that his name was Victor, and that essentially because he had been close to her daddy when he died, his spirit had imparted itself slightly into Lois, so therefore he could see what was sort of happening to him, and was trying to warn Ellie something would happen so that she could warn her mum. And her mum was not really listening to her. I mean, like, she had an idea that something was up with Lois, but you know, she just thought Ellie was just having these childish nightmares. But when Ellie said that Victor Pascal had given her this knowledge that something was wrong with her dad, she knew that Ellie didn't know anything about what had happened that day to Victor Pascal. Like, she didn't know that name, and that was actually what triggered her into the car to drive back home. Um, so yeah, it's a very it's a thrilling horror story. Like, you know, it's sort of slow to begin with. You're just sort of reading about the family life and you know, the odd thing about the pet cemetery and the history of the place, really. But I think then once you get to about 200 pages, then it really picks up, and you can sort of see, like, especially when Gage dies, oh, something big is going to happen here. Like, obviously they're going to try and reanimate this child, because I think obviously most parents, if they were given the opportunity to bring their child back after they were deceased, would try to take that. And I think this is like probably what Stephen King is on about when he's like, I can't believe I went there. Um, you know, because talking about child death is horrible. Reanimating, you know, the spirit and then killing the person's own child again, that is pretty terrible. It is almost as terrible as that scene from It, but I still think that scene from It is slightly worse. But yeah, I really enjoyed this as a read. I think it was a perfect Halloween read. I give this 5 stars. I couldn't really knock anything off, because I think that the ending of the story landed really, really well, and it sort you still had questions. Like, it was a really good twist in those last few lines where he decided that he was going to go reanimate Rachel, because you'd think he'd learned his lesson the first time. But you also don't really know what happens, so you're sort of left with that open question. I think you could definitely reread this book over and over again, even though you know kind of like what happens after you've read it the first time. And it leaves you with a lot of questions about mortality and what would you do yourself in that situation. So I think this was really, really worth a read, and I'm glad I saved it for Halloween. So, top book by Stephen King. Unfortunately for me, it's still not my top book, because I still think Christine beats this one, because Christine was a hell of a book. But still, not disappointed with this at all. Absolutely fantastic read. So if you've read Pet Sematary yourself and you agree with what I've said, or you disagree with what I've said, or you just want to make any comments on the book, really, just let me know down below in the comments. And I look forward to the next time we do our next Stephen King summary of a book. And I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.